right-wing people, these like intellectual dark web people, these like anti-SJWs and like anti-cultural Marxist people talking about how the university campus has become a Marxist training camp. Like that's something that I've just heard so much from, especially from like STEM nerds and just people who think that they're better than studying the humanities. As somebody who has gone to university and studied the humanities, I studied philosophy and also art history and film studies. I can assure you that from my own experience and from just my research into university culture, that is a complete fabrication. Like it shouldn't be surprising that these types of people are inventing straw men to argue against, but they are kind of like onto something. They're picking up on a like dominant ideology that certainly does exist in humanities departments, but like most things, they have misunderstood it. In fact, it is my theory that the university has become a Foucauldian training ground. I took so many different courses in so many different departments, and I studied Foucault in the religious studies department. I read him in the philosophy department. I read him in art history and read so many of his like followers in art history. He's in anthropology. He's just everywhere. It's really insane how popular his like genealogical method has become. It's like the kind of like the de facto standard, especially in art history. Like when you're trying like it is true that like feminism and decolonialism is, at least at my school, like a very popular methodological, historiographical approach to studying these disciplines. And within those approaches, Foucauldian theory, like biopolitics especially, and the genealogical approach is just like very predominant. And I wanted to take a moment to try to explain like what that is and why it is so bankrupt as a concept. I'm not coming from obviously maybe that's not obvious given that I have no presence on the internet, but I'm not coming from a right-wing perspective. I'm coming from a materialist perspective. So I studied Foucault like decently, and I came to the conclusion that his concept of power, which so much of his philosophy rests on and his critical methodology rests on, is essentially an idealist concept. It is counter-revolutionary. I mean, there's more to say about Foucault's relationship to revolution. It's not so clear-cut, black and white, but ultimately the concept of power that his philosophy rests on is idealist and therefore anti-materialist. Anyway, I'm going to read a little bit from a very famous essay of his called "What is Enlightenment?" I just have it here in the Foucault Reader. Where this is like "What is Enlightenment" is also a very famous essay written by Immanuel Kant about like what it takes for human society to move forward and what it takes for how the individual can relate to that society and like have a positive impact, yada yada. This is kind of like a Foucauldian like update of that based on his own, like, because Kant as well was a critical philosopher, and Foucault is trying to like update that in a more ostensibly radical way. Where was I going to read? Yes. We are not talking about a gesture of rejection. We have to move beyond the outside-inside alternative. We have to be at the frontiers. Criticism indeed consists of analyzing and reflecting upon limits. But if the Kantian question was that of knowing what limits knowledge has to renounce transgressing, it seems to me that the critical question today has to be turned back into a positive one. In what is given to us as universal, necessary, obligatory, what place is occupied by whatever is singular, contingent, and the product of arbitrary constraints? The point, in brief, is to transform the critique conducted in the form of necessary limitation into a practical critique that takes the form of a possible transgression. This entails an obvious consequence, that criticism is no longer going to be practiced in the search for formal structures with universal value, but rather as a historical investigation into the events that have led us to constitute ourselves and to recognize ourselves as subjects of what we are doing, thinking, saying. In that sense, this criticism is not transcendental, and its goal is not that of making a metaphysics possible. It is genealogical in its design and archaeological in its method. Archaeological and not transcendental in the sense that it will not seek to identify the universal structures of all knowledge or of all possible moral action, but will seek to treat the instances of discourse that articulate what we think, say, and do as so many historical events. And this critique will be genealogical in the sense that it will not deduce from the form of what we are what it is impossible for us to do and to know, but it will separate out from the contingency that has made us what we are the possibility of no longer being, doing, or thinking what we are, do, or think. It is not seeking to make possible a metaphysics that has finally become a science. It is seeking to give new impetus, as far and wide as possible, to the undefined work of freedom. I prefer the very specific transformations that have proved to be possible in the last 20 years in a certain number of areas that concern our ways of being and thinking, relations to authority, relations between the sexes, the way in which we perceive insanity or illness. I prefer even these partial transformations that have been made in the correlation of historical analysis and the practical attitude to the programs for a new man that the worst political systems have repeated throughout the 20th century. I shall thus characterize the philosophical ethos appropriate to the critical ontology of ourselves as a historico-practical test of the limits that we may go beyond, and thus as work carried out by ourselves upon ourselves as free beings. So basically, there's something really important here that is very congruent, I think, with a materialist, Marxist, revolutionary historical approach, which is that he wants to see the structures, the present way of things, the way that we are, the way that our society is, as deriving from historical events. That's the archaeological method that he talks about, which is very fair. Is the way to do it. The fact is that's a very material way of approaching it, because the way that we think, the way that we conceive ourselves as subjects, the way that we relate to each other, the way that our society is set up is a material construct that has arrived through definite things that happened in history. But it's really the genealogical design that I think that is counterproductive, because he is very adamant. In his own life, he was very Foucault was very involved in various political struggles. He was really involved in a movement to reform prisons. He founded a group that did a lot of research publicizing the horrible way that prisons in France were structured. He was always out there on the barricades, protesting against AIDS policies, and he did all of these real things, and also all of his works, of course, are critical of these and fairly critical. He certainly made some good points about like discipline and the way that our disciplinary society is structured and like the historical genesis of that. Sure, these are all very fair critiques of like certain localized phenomena, but the problem with him is that he is like intentionally and philosophically committed to producing nothing but these kind of localized critiques. He cannot and is opposed to the idea of connecting, for example, prison reform with like questions of like racial like identification or like the economic structures of society and how all these various systems play into each other, and ultimately how they are contingent upon one question, one issue, one site of exploitation in particular, which I won't name, but should be obvious what it is. But he's committed philosophically and in practice to only constructing these localized and isolated critiques, because he believes that to construct a more grand narrative where these things can be connected together is in fact a form of doing violence to like the contingencies of history and the impossibility of knowing everything, which ultimately like is just an ineffective way of criticizing historical phenomena. Like and he will also relate, like he will form a connection between these various historical epochs, for example, like the sovereign with the post-sovereign, and then with like monarchic and with ancient forms of like power. He has like this concept of power knowledge and how it does like there's like a chain of causal connection through history that connects these like distinct historical epochs of like government and like all the technologies of control and all that. But he's unable to unite them, not reduce them, but to unite them in one solid concept that will allow us to understand how these things are related. And they are related. They're related through the fact of their material composition. Foucault has this concept of power that he is going to say is like the historical being. It's like a historical ontological concept that runs through history and relates all of these different periods. But he really like adamantly refuses, on like principled grounds, to give a name to that concept of power. He refuses to give it a being other than like an empty concept of being. That's why I think he is ultimately an idealist, and why you can find him in his later life like explicitly supporting neoliberal policies. But yeah, like this idea of like constructing these like localized critiques as like a genealogical method, and then like not connecting them together. It's and like his motivation for even engaging in these critiques in the first place, which are like in a limited sense radical, not revolutionary, but they are in a limited sense radical. It's just pure reformism. Like he's unable to like connect critique together in order to form like a global, universal theory of revolution. Revolution is supposed to be it's a theory that unifies like all of these various sites and is a complete reversal of history. It's a complete like détournement of all of the historical forces that have led us to this point. But Foucault is unable to do that. He's unwilling to do that. He thinks that it's actually a bad thing to do that. which I think, I mean, is just to his detriment. Like, and I mean, people will want to talk about like what good can be extracted from Foucault. Like, he put all this work and labor and did all this research and is like admittedly an incredibly good writer. He's just like a very compelling. Like his essays in particular are like just very compelling, very fluid and moving, very well written. So like, should we abandon him entirely and like discount his revelations, his discoveries? Well, I don't think that he has actually discovered anything original. I think that the insights that we get from Foucault are already present in Marx, in Lenin, in Mao, in real revolutionary theorists who were committed to finding a causal explanation for these various like areas of exploitation and oppression that and like uniting them to form like a general theory of revolution rather than these like localized reformist theories of revolution that Foucault was like explicitly committed to. Like the conclusion of this essay, What is Enlightenment, is him saying that like basically we can never like attain like some kind of ideal state, like a telos, end of history or something like that. So really the goal for radicals, for people who are committed to critique, for critics, is to just like continue doing their work that is isolated and not trying to connect, for example, prison reform with racial injustice, with like with economic injustice. And how does that relate to the right wing talking point of how universities are Marxist training camps? Well, I think that it is like, obviously these idiots don't fucking know what the hell they're talking about, so it's not surprising that they are just completely misreading the actual conditions of society. But they are right in targeting Marx and Marx's like true followers, his fucking true followers, because like there is something dangerous in Marx. That's why the CIA was so heavily involved in flooding the academic market with these post-structuralist theorists, because they wanted to distract people from something that could actually make a difference. And the right wing, the enemy, is sensitive to the power of like a true revolutionary theory of critique, or true revolutionary critical theory, which is why they criticize Marx, even though Foucault is in fact the dominant methodological, ideological like figure within humanities departments. And why is Foucault that figure? Why will you be, whether or not your professor is explicitly stating it or not, why will you be following in his footsteps if you get into any kind of critical methodological approach in any kind of humanities department? It's because he is distracting, because he promises something that he is unable to deliver on, that his philosophy is just not geared towards. He can give you these tools that will allow you to make small changes, small reformist changes. You'll be able to use the genealogical method and like this theory of biopower in order to make like critical changes to just like localized sites, just like Foucault wanted. He wants you to reform like specific areas, specific institutions of civilization, but not to actually overturn them, not to connect them together, not to see what is the connective tissue of all of these various forces. Yeah, that's all I'll say for now.